The King's Indian Defence, written by Ravikumar, international master from India, and read by Michael Basman. If you're playing black and your opponent begins with 1d4, it would be a good idea to play an aggressive line like the King's Indian Defence, mainly because your opponent in playing d4 clearly wants a positional game, and if you go straight into the counter-attack against his king, this will bring him into positions he isn't going to be too happy playing. Now, the King's Indian is a daunting defence. It's played by grandmasters, it's heavily analysed, loads of variations, so club players are likely to be wary of it. We've tried to simplify your task on this tape by giving you just one line for black against whatever white may come up against. That is, not just one line, but against all his tries, you'd try one defence. And also we're looking at it from black's point of view, which is also going to be helpful because it's much easier for a player to take sides, as it were, than to sort of have an objective overview of this or that system. So here we go. Let's start with the first system, which is going to be the exchange system. We'll play the first few moves out. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, black plays bishop g7, white pawn to e4, and black here plays pawn to d6. White plays knight f3. This is the start of the classical system. White, having put 3 pawns up on the board, he now continues to develop pieces. There are certainly a lot of other variations white could choose at this point instead of knight f3, and we'll be looking at them in the course of this lecture. White could play the 4 pawns attack with f4. He could play f3 instead of knight f3. That starts the same-ish. He could also play g3. I think those are the main ones. Now, this knight f3, white's going to continue by castling kingside and then hope that his extra space control with his pawns is going to give him the advantage. So knight f3 for white, black castles, white plays bishop e2. Now black has a number of possibilities here, but we're going to recommend you play e5 straight away. This counterattacks against white's central position and gives white the option of pushing on pawn to d5 or bishop to e3 to guard his center. Now, the line we want to look at for white is one which may occur in your games, and this is where white plays pawn takes on d5. Sorry, pawn takes on e5. Black must recapture, and now white can exchange the queens. Queen takes d8, black plays rook takes d8. Now, looking at this position, it seems white can win a pawn here by knight takes e5. In fact, this is not the case. After knight takes e5, black has a little combination, knight takes e4. And now if white plays knight takes e4, black will play bishop takes e5. And actually this position should be fully equal for black. So white doesn't take this pawn. Let's put those pieces back, have the white knight back on f3, the black knight back on f6, and the white pawn on e4 and the black pawn on e5. Well, if white doesn't fall into this trap, his most popular move is bishop to g5, because this has a direct threat of playing knight to d5 and putting pressure on black's pinned knight. Now, I think theory recommends rook e8 here, which is okay for equality, but on our tape, we're going to suggest a different move, one which isn't well known, but also leads to interesting play and should give black at least equality. This is the move pawn to c6. Now this is a very logical move because white's knight isn't able to come into d5, and this therefore takes away the outpost for the white knight. Black could have played, say, well, he could have played knight a6 or knight c6, but they aren't so good. So c6 is going to be played, and again white can take this pawn on e5. We'll let him do that. Knight takes e5. Black sets about trying to recover it. He plays rook e8. Now if white doesn't want to lose his pawn on e4, he must play pawn to f4. Black plays pawn to h6, and white moves his bishop back to h4. It's not much use white taking the knight off on f6, because if he does, black will recapture with the bishop, and then white's going to have to move his knight back to f3 or d3, and after that black can just play bishop takes c3 check and rook takes e4, and as you can see he's regained his pawn with quite a good game. Now we're going to put white's bishop back on h4, not capture on f6, and play for black knight to a6. White now castles queenside, and black plays knight to c5. The knight now threatening to regain the pawn on e4. So white's only choice really is to play bishop to f3, and black now moves pawn to g5. White plays pawn takes g5, and black plays also pawn takes g5. Now this isn't a pawn sacrifice, because if white plays bishop takes g5, black will capture the now undefended knight at e5. So white's got to put his bishop back to g3. Black now pushes on pawn to g4, and the bishop goes to e2. Black's next is to play knight c5 takes e4. White knight takes on e4. Black knight on f6 takes e4. Now here it looks like white can capture on g4, though it doesn't really bring him any advantage. If he plays knight e5 takes g4, black plays knight takes g3, white plays pawn takes g3, and now bishop to f5 for black. At first sight you'd have thought black could play rook takes e2 and not bishop to f5, but that would have been answered strongly by white rook to d8 check, which would have given white a draw. So bishop f5. White now saves his bishop by bishop to f3, and black plays bishop to g6. And this is a very comfortable position for black. He's got these two very strong bishops. He's a pawn down, so we're going to assess the position as roughly even. The two bishops balancing out the extra pawn, doubled though it is. Now if you'll put your pieces back in diagram 1, we're going to look at an alternative for white. Instead of this bishop g5 move, we've got another promising move, which is knight to d5. Now we're going to follow a suggestion of Ullman, I believe. Black plays knight takes d5. He can't play knight takes e4 because white was threatening to take on c7. So knight takes d5 by black. White plays c takes d5. There are two reasons why white would not play e takes d5. First reason would be that after e takes d5, black's bishop, which is sometimes a problem piece in this variation, King's Indian, because it's blocked by the pawn we put on e5, and we decided to put the pawn there to get some pawn control of the center, though it does limit the bishop sometimes as well. But this is the balance we have to make. So after white plays e takes d5, black could free his bishop, say with e4, if not now, at some time. There's a second reason for not playing e takes d5, and instead playing c takes d5. If white plays c takes d5, he opens up the c line, and he's trying to attack the base pawn, black's pawn at c7, which is always a weak spot in the black camp. So if white gets time, he's going to put a lot of pressure on that pawn. That's why black reacts very quickly after c takes d5 by playing pawn to c6, ready to eliminate the pawn. White must really defend with bishop c4, and here black can play c takes d5 followed by knight c6, but even more aggressive is b5, white bishop b3, and then bishop to b7, and white's going to have to let go of his outpost in the center, after which black has even got a lead in development, our lead in development being regarded as the fact that he's castled and brought his rook into action, whereas white has not done so. You'll often find this idea turning up in the King's Indian, this idea of extra development, and it really arises because white spends quite a few moves with his pawns, setting up a pawn center, and he's often not ready to resist a sudden counterattack by black. Now let's reset the pieces in the start position. We're going to look at another variation of the classical system, and this is called the Petrosian system, after the great Armenian player Tigran Petrosian had great success with this in the 1960s. Now we'll play the first few moves again: d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, starting the classical system, black castles, and white plays bishop to e2. Once again we play pawn to e5, but this time we don't play for white pawn takes on e5, we play pawn to d5. I'll just mention also that white's move bishop to, instead of pawn to d5, white's move bishop to e3 isn't regarded as very dangerous for black, because black can play knight g4, bishop g5, and black plays f6. Bishop drops back to c1 or h4. Now black can maneuver his knight round to h6 and f7, and black is fully ready with his thrust pawn to f5, which is one of the keys to the system. So let's have white's bishop back on c1, black's pawn on f7, and black's knight is still on f6. Now white is going to play pawn to d5, locking up the position. Now black's plan is to play knight to d7. He sees already the chance of an outpost on c5 for the knight, due to white having moved his pawn up to d5. So knight to d7 happens, and Petrosian's system begins with bishop to g5. The idea of this is to restrain black from moving his f6 knight, and thus prevent him from getting his pawn advance, pawn to f5. If black can play pawn to f5, he opens the line for his rook, and he also starts a very strong attack against the white king. So this is just a preventive move, bishop to g5. Of course, black can immediately drive the bishop away by h6 and g5, and the bishop lands up on g3. But then the point of the Petrosian system is to try and occupy the weakened white squares, try and take advantage of the weakened white squares at h5, f5, and g4, possibly using his bishop from e2, going to g4. And this this control of the white squares was often a lethal weapon against the king's Indian, especially as we see all his pawns on black squares and his bishop g7 on black squares. Now let's see how we're going to combat this thrust against us. After bishop to g5, we play pawn to h6, putting the question to the bishop immediately. Bishop drops back to h4. And we don't yet play pawn to g5. We try to free our knight in a different way. We play knight to c5. White castles. And now black plays pawn to a5. White plays knight to d2. This move is to save his e-pawn from capture at some point. Also opens the line of the bishop to h5, and black isn't going to be able to play knight to h5 very easily, so he's going to have to put his knight back on a more passive position. So black's next move is bishop to d7, white queen c2, black queen to e8. Now we've got rather subtle position arising here. Black has at last freed his knight from the pin, and he's ready to put it back onto h7 and then advance with pawn to f5. And after this, white's bishop on h4 may even be in danger of getting trapped. Now at the same time we must look at white's strategic plans, which are to advance on the queen side. He wants to get in b4 and then c5, and then because he has the space advantage with his pawn on d5, his best attacking chances should lie on the side where he has more space. So that's what white wants to do. Now to get rid of the knight at c5, he wants to try a3 first, but this won't work if black answers pawn to a4, because if then white plays pawn to b4, black will capture en passant. So white first has to play pawn to b3, then he'll play a3, and then he'll play b4, drive the knight back, and then he'll be ready later to play pawn c5. Now at the same time he's got to take into account black's threats, and we must look and see what would happen if white played pawn to f3 here. In that case, black would immediately play his knight to h5, and his knight would be able to come in onto f4. So white delays that move of the pawn up to f3, at least until black's put his knight elsewhere. Now the other point is, what would happen if white played pawn to b3 straight away? Now in that case, black has a very interesting tactical series of moves. He plays pawn to g5, white bishop g3, and now he captures at e4 with his knight from f6. This is a temporary piece sacrifice. Knight takes on e4. White plays knight takes e4, presumably the one from d2. Black plays knight takes e4, and white captures with the knight, the other knight. Could take with the queen, but it doesn't make any difference. Black now plays pawn to f5. And now if the white knight goes away, black will play pawn to f4, regaining his piece and keeping the two bishops. On the other hand, after pawn to f5, white will probably play pawn to f3. Black now gets his piece back, pawn takes on e4, and white plays pawn takes on e4. And at first sight, this position is quite good for white, because black appears to have weakened his position on the king's side. He also appears to have a bad bishop at g7. In actual fact, if black plays something like rook takes f1 check, white rook takes f1, and then queen to g6, it is in fact black who has the advantage, and this is due to his space superiority on the king's side. white has to play quite carefully, even to equalize this position. Black's threatening h5, h4. White can't play something like queen d1 to get control of g4 or put a bishop on h5, because in the first place he would lose his pawn on e4. In the second place, black could probably play pawn to g4. So this is an interesting counter to the Petrosian system. Black accepts what are apparently pawn weaknesses on the king's side, but in fact it's a space advantage. In this position, black must be careful against white's possible pawn to c5, so black could in that case play pawn to b6 at some point, and then hope later to play pawn to a4 to open up the queen side. But his main chances lie on the king side. Now if you go back to diagram 3, you remember at this point we suggested white playing pawn to b3, and then we showed how black can counterattack with this sacrifice. Now this is why instead of pawn to b3, white plays the subtle bishop g3, and this prevents black from making his freeing maneuver. So black must go back to his standard plan and play his knight to h7. White goes b3, black f5, threatening of course f4. Now it's the time for white to play f3. Black now plays queen e7. White plays a3. Black now plays h5. White plays rook f1 to d1. Black plays bishop h6. White now plays bishop f2. And black plays queen to g5. White plays rook a1 to b1, and black plays h5 to h4, h5 to h4. Now black's made quite a lot of progress on the king's side. His attack is beginning to look threatening against the white king. Also, if white plays something like b4 here, black will capture. White recaptures, and then black can play his knight into a4, which is quite awkward for white, because if he takes on a4, black plays bishop takes a4, and he skewers the white queen at c2 and the rook at d1. Even if black didn't have this tactic available, he might consider playing first pawn to b6 instead of his h4 move, and then when white's pawn got up to b4, the black knight could go back to b7. So black has got pretty good attacking chances here. Now I want you to return again to diagram 2, and after black's e5, let's see what happens if white castles. If he doesn't play this Petrosian system with d5 and bishop to g5, he castles. Now we could play knight d7 here, but more aggressive is to play knight c6. And here it's not good for white to capture on e5, because black's much closer to occupying the d4 square with his knight from c6. So white will play pawn to d5. Black plays knight e7. And now white has a choice of several moves. One of them is to play pawn to b4. This move was very popular in the 1960s. When Gligorich used to play this line, he met b4 nearly every time. And the idea of b4 was to then push on with c5, of course immediate and rapid attack against the black queen side before black could get his counter going. Now we're going to suggest for black here to choose the move knight to h5. White plays c5, and black brings his knight in to f4. At this point it's not really good for white to capture the knight on f4, because this will free the black bishop at g7. So after bishop takes f4, g takes f4, white then has to play rook c1 to guard his knight at c3, and black just plays h7 to h6, followed by g6 to g5 with a pretty good kingside pawn avalanche, plus the, as I said, freed bishop, possible use of the e5 square for his knight coming round via g6. So let's go back to diagram 5 now and play for white pawn to b4, knight h5, and now white attempts to stop the knight invading on f4, and he plays pawn to g3. We'll see the drawback of this move later. Black now advances pawn to f5. White plays knight g5, and this move is to try and put the knight in on e6, the square weakened by black's pawn f5. It also discovers an attack from the bishop e2 against the knight at h5. So black now plays his knight back to f6. White now supports his e4 pawn, pawn to f3, and here black plays a rather subtle move, but it seems to be normal. King to h8. As the white knight's going to come in on e6, there's possibilities that the diagonal leading from a2 to g8 is going to be opened. You can clearly imagine white queen going to b3, and possibly after c5 the white bishop coming to c4. So this is a precautionary measure, putting the king on e8, on h8. Now sometime or other, might as well be now as any time, white's going to play knight to e6. Black will play bishop takes e6. White will play pawn takes e6. And now black will play pawn to c6. You might think that he could immediately play queen to c8 and capture that pawn at e6. But this isn't really the case, because white has the tactical answer knight to d5. And then after black plays queen takes e6, white would play knight takes c7 and fork the queen at e6 and the rook at a8. So this pawn c6 is to stop the white knight coming in onto d5. At the same time, black is postponing his immediate attempt to pick up the pawn at e6, because now if he played queen c8, then his d6 pawn would go. However, that e6 pawn is weak. Black hopes, and usually does, round it up by playing knight e8, knight to c7, and knight takes e6. Now in assessing this position, we have to decide that white has the two bishops, but he has got a weak pawn at e6. And also black's got rather impressive centre of pawns at c6, d6, and e5, and f5. Most of all, white has weakened his king position by these moves g3 and f3, so black should get very good counter-attacking chances later in the game by pushing on pawn to f4 after he's rounded up the white pawn at e6. So this position looks pretty good for black. Now I want to go back again to diagram 5, and instead of playing this b4 move, which we have just dealt with, we're going to choose another one for white. This is knight to d2. And this move is smartly answered by black playing bishop h6. It wasn't possible to play knight h5, but bishop h6 is quite good. Black's going to eventually exchange off his bad bishop for the white bishop at c1, and this should get rid of all black's positional problems. After bishop h6, white plays b4. Black now moves his knight to d7, and we know why. White goes knight b3. Black bishop takes c1. White rook takes c1. And black plays pawn to f5. White supports his center with pawn to f3. Black knight to f6. Everything is going like clockwork. White also goes like clockwork, pawn to c5. And now black plays knight to h5. Now this position, I suppose you can also call unclear, but black also seems to have possibly the edge. His knight's going to threaten to come in onto f4, If white plays something like c takes d6, c takes d6, knight b5, black should be able to hold the balance by playing f takes e4. There is one small problem. Black, having eliminated his king's bishop, he still has a small problem of getting his knight on e7 into action. And he can do this by trying to regroup by playing king g7, followed by knight to g8 and knight to f6. And this will bring the knight into a useful post. Now let's go back again to diagram 5 and we'll look at the most critical line of the main line. This is where white plays knight to e1. And this plan is to combine defense and attack, and to put the knight on d3 rather than on b3. On d3 it's more centralized, and it also guards the f4 square. After knight e1, black plays knight to e8. White goes knight to d7. Sorry, white goes knight to d3. Black plays pawn to f5. Now, quiet looking move. White plays bishop to d2. Doesn't really want to put it on e3. And he doesn't want to play f3 yet. He doesn't want to commit himself with f3. Plays bishop to d2. Now here black should not rush headlong forward with pawn to f4, because white can then play bishop to g4, which is to take control of the white squares, exchange off black's white squared bishop, leaving him with his bad bishop at g7. Furthermore, if white gets his bishop to g4 and exchanges off black's c8 bishop, this does hamper black's attack quite seriously, because often black needs the bishop at c8 to make a destructive sacrifice against white's king side. So be very careful to avoid this sort of strategic blunder in the King's Indian. So let's have white's bishop back on e2 and black's pawn back on f5. So instead of playing f4, black plays knight f6, putting pressure on the e-pawn, and white plays pawn to f3. Now at this point it looks like black should go knight to h5 and carry on with his normal plans, but this isn't quite so strong anymore. White has a knight on d3 and a bishop on d2 and is guarding that square quite well. So instead black goes for the kingside space advantage and the pawn avalanche, and he plays pawn to f4. White in his turn goes for the queenside. Rook c1, black g5, white c5, black goes knight g6, white plays c takes d6, black c takes d6. White immediately moves in, knight to b5, threatening to come in on c7. This isn't a blunder losing a piece. If black plays queen b6 check, white can just play knight to f2, and his knight on b5 is guarded by the bishop on e2. So to stop anything coming in on c7, black plays the important move knight to e8. And this guards c7 and also the base pawn at d6, the pawn which supports the e5 pawn, which supports the f4 pawn. So knight e8, white queen c2. Now comes another attacking and defending move. Black plays rook f7. This has got interesting ideas behind it. It guards c7. It also vacates the f8 square for the bishop to come back and guard the d6 pawn. And there's a counter-attacking threat of the rook going to g7, moving itself along the second rank onto g7, which will help the thrust pawn to g4. So remember these moves which serve defensive and attacking purposes. Now white's next move is knight f2. This is to put more pressure on the g4 square so that black will not be able to advance his pawn so easily there. And now black plays bishop f8. And now white plays pawn to a4. He could, at this point, have played knight takes a7. So let's have a look at that. Have that white pawn back on a2. And we'll play the sacrifice knight takes a7. Now, if black plays rook takes a7, he just loses his position after white plays queen takes c8. But black's got two interesting defenses here. The first one is to play rook c7, white bishop a5, pinning the rook. Rook takes queen on c2. White also takes the queen, bishop takes d8. Black takes a bishop, rook takes e2. And white takes another bishop, knight takes c8. And now black takes a pawn, rook takes a2. So, peculiar sort of interchange. White's managed to get two pieces promoted on the back rank, but unfortunately they're not pawns. But the position is materially even. White, say, could pick up the pawn at g5, but then black would pick up the pawn at b2. And also black has got rooks doubled on the second row and the possibility of a queenside passed pawn, the b pawn. So this position doesn't look too bad for black at all. Now, let's go back to our diagram 6. Now another line for white, if that's for black, so if white plays knight takes a7, black can just simply keep all the pieces on and play bishop to d7. And this strands the knight, which now must move out. White must play knight b5. This has cost white a couple of tempi. It's gained him a pawn, and in fact it's not even clear it's gained him a pawn because black can play rook takes a2. But black could play it this way as well. So let's have black's pawn back on a7, white's knight on b5, black bishop on c8. This is diagram 6. And instead of capturing on a7, we're going to play pawn to a4 for white. Black now continues pawn to h5. White plays pawn to h3. Black plays rook g7. White plays b4. White could at any point here again take on a7, but then black could probably play bishop d7. Now, it's about time for black to start his attack. He plays knight to h4. And things are looking quite serious for white now. The threat of g4 is getting pretty strong. Maybe black would preface it with knight f6, but things are starting to loom around the white king side. Now there was a recent development in the white game, an interesting sacrifice invented by the Russian Raskovsky, and this is to play knight takes a7 again, but with a different idea in mind. Now black plays rook c7. Possibly he could also play bishop d7, but we'll look at rook c7. Now white hasn't got bishop a5 in his position, but he has got an amazing sacrifice. He plays knight c6. Black plays b takes c6. White d5 takes c6. And this position, we'd have to call it unclear. White's got 3 pawns for the piece. Well, he's got 3 passed pawns. He hasn't actually got 3 pawns. On the other hand, black's got the piece and the kingside attack. Who pays your money and takes your choice? I think I'd probably choose black because I usually prefer to mate people. Now, let's have a look at some of the possibilities from this position. Let's say black plays rook g7 and white just starts to roll the pawns. b5. Black king h8. a5. Black knight f6. b6, black g4. Now white goes for the material, b7. Here black can even sacrifice, well, virtually a queen and a rook. He can play g takes f3. White plays pawn takes rook equals queen. Black plays pawn takes on e2. White plays rook f1 to e1. Black rook takes g2 check. White king h1. Black rook takes f2. Now, despite white's rather substantial material advantage, I'll just try and count it up. White seems to have... hang on. Yes, it looks like white has got a queen and a rook against 3 black minor pieces. But we must consider that black is threatening mate by knight to f3, followed by rook h2. And he's also even threatening at least a draw by perpetual check by bishop g4. And if white plays queen takes queen, black can play bishop to f3 check, and so on. So this position, I think, should be satisfactory for black. Now we're going to leave the classical variation and move on to one of the other very common lines you're liable to face, and that is the same-ish system. So please go back to the start position and we'll make the moves. White pawn d4, black knight f6, white pawn c4, black pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, and white plays f3, black castles, white plays bishop to e3. Let's see what the idea behind the whole same-ish system is. This is for white to play queen d2 and then bishop h6, and he's put his pawn onto f3 to stop black's knight coming to g4, harassing his bishop. The pawn on f3 as well as that supports a possible pawn g4, though white will probably prefer to advance h4, h5 quickly, with or without the support of the pawn at g4, in order to get this automatic attack going against the black king. So queen d2, h4, h5, bishop h6, queen coming to h6, and then some sort of mate on h7. Now, black can play the line knight c6 here, but this is very complicated, and at the same time it does give white very good attacking chances. It's a pretty unclear system. We won't say anything one way or another about that system. I think it's one you might like to try. It's certainly really a very exciting system indeed. But the one we're going to choose is much more straightforward and I think much easier to play, and it has had considerable practical success. So we're going to choose pawn to e5 here. Now white plays pawn to d5. He wants the center blocked if he's going to start his kingside thrust. And now the key move of the system, pawn to c6. Now the opening of the c file seems to help white, because after all he was the one supposed to be attacking on the queen side. However, black is trying to utilize his lead in development to open up the c file, and if white lags too far behind, black will get a counterattack on the queen side as well. For example, his queen coming to a5 can be quite strong. On the other hand, this c6 move is also a good waiting move. The thing that black doesn't know yet is where is the white king going to place itself. If it goes onto the queen side, black will choose one system. If it goes onto the king side, black will have to play another. So black has to sort of play on both wings as well, on the queen side and the king side. has to play quite a subtle game and make moves which will cater for both white's possible plans. And c6 is one such move. So white plays queen d2, black plays c takes d5, white plays c takes d5. I'd mention, of course, that white could have played knight takes d5, but then after black knight takes d5, if white recaptures queen takes d5, black can just play knight c6, and he'll be able to utilize the d4 square for his knight, which more than counterbalances his weak pawn at d6. And don't forget also white's quite a way behind in development. King's Indian Defence, Side 2. Now we're looking at the sameish variation. I'd like you to set up diagram 7, and white's just played c takes d5, to which black answered knight b8 to d7. And here white's got two plans he can choose from. One involves putting his king on the queen side, and the other on the king side. Now let's look first at where white castles queen side. So castles queen side for white. Black's answer is to play knight to h5. Now white aims for a kingside attack, but black doesn't intend himself just to lie down passively on the king side. He does need to play on both wings and in the center. So he plays knight h5, and here if white plays g4, black will then play knight to f4, which is a thematic sort of sacrifice. If white now plays bishop takes f4, black pawn takes f4, white queen takes f4, black gets a very strong attack by the move queen to a5. And he has several trumps in his position. He's got the open diagonal for his bishop. He's got the e5 square for his knight coming from d7. And he can later play bishop d7 and rook c8. That's a nice open file. As we said, black sometimes himself uses the open c file instead of white. Finally, he may play f7 to f5 at some point. This isn't so much to open the f file, but to exchange the pawns and open the diagonal leading from white's b1 to h7, which can be used often quite strongly by the white squared bishop. So let's put those pieces back. We'll go back to diagram 7 and add the moves white castles queen side, black plays knight to h5. Now here white doesn't thrust forward with g4. He plays king b1 first, a good precautionary move, getting the king off that dangerous c file. Black plays f5. Now if white doesn't capture now on f5, black will play f4, which will considerably limit white's opportunities of attack on the king side, and then black will be able to have, say, a free hand on the queen side. So white takes on f5, e takes f5, black plays g takes f5, and now white does try pawn to g4. Now here it looks like black can play f takes g4, but instead he plays knight to f4. The point is he doesn't want to yet give white control of the e4 square by capturing on g4. So he wants to capture there as late as possible. Once again, white could capture on f4, bishop takes f4, but black's answer would be similar. He would recapture and then play queen to a5 with a strong counterattack. So white plays the natural move knight g1 to e2. And black plays, still in gambit style, knight to c5. Now, here white can capture on f4 with his knight, which is going to be rather better than capturing with his bishop, because he needs his bishop to oppose the power of the black bishop at g7. If we look at white playing knight takes f4, black playing e takes f4, and white playing bishop takes f4, this only really serves to open the lines for black, because he plays f takes g4, white f takes g4, and then black bishop takes g4, and black has really a tremendous looking game here. Now we'll have some of those pieces back. Black pawn on e5, white bishop on e3, white knight on e2, black knight on f4, white pawns on g4 and f3. So white here plays a cunning move. He plays pawn to h3. Doesn't take on f4. He is now threatening to capture on f4 because he's guarded his g4 pawn again. And this threat is a lot more serious than before. Black therefore chooses to bring his knight from f4 back to g6. Discretion being the better part of valor. People often wonder at various points in the King's Indian when white has a bishop on e3 and black plonks his knight on c5. Should white play bishop takes c5? Is it a good move? Usually it's not a good move, because you get rid of your good bishop for black's knight, and you're left with a bishop which is on the white squares, and all your pawns are on white squares, so you just lose black square control. And that's the case even if after bishop takes c5 you actually say double black's pawns, and he has pawns on c7 and c5. So usually it's not a good idea to take on c5 with the bishop. Now after black's knight g6, white plays knight to c1. He's planning to play knight d3, put pressure on the black knight at c5. And now comes a very instructive moment in the game. Black plays the move pawn to e4. This is opening the diagonal. White plays f takes e4. And now black doesn't capture on g4. It looks like black can regain his pawn either by f takes e4 or f takes g4. But f takes g4 should not be played, because after white recaptures 8 takes g4, the h file is open for white. So instead black plays f4, pawn to f4. White plays bishop to d4, trying to oppose the power of the bishop at g7. And black plays knight from g6 to e5. Now let's see what black's got for his pawn sacrifice. He's got active bishop at g7, possible passed f pawn, and the e5 outpost. 3 big advantages. White now played queen to f2. At the moment we're following the game Miles against Thipsay. Thipsay being the Indian national champion, and he almost became the British champion this year at Brighton, 1984. He was stopped finally by Jonathan Spielman in the last round. But had he beaten Spielman, then he'd have been joint champion with Nigel Short. And in fact, on his way to this really good, really big success, Thipsay did beat Miles and effectively finished Miles' chances of even getting a high prize. So Miles Thipsay, queen to f2. White is now threatening to capture on c5, because then he'll win a second pawn. Bishop takes c5, pawn takes c5, queen takes c5. However, Thipsay simply let white win that pawn. He just played bishop d7. White bishop takes c5, d takes c5, white queen takes c5. Black queen to f6. So black considers it was worthwhile to get rid of white's neutralizing black squared bishop just to give him another pawn. Queen's coming to f6. And they're already starting to be dangerous threats against the white king. White now played knight d3, black rook a8 to c8. White could have taken on a7, but he decided discretion was the better part of valor. He played queen to d4, and black played rook c4. After rook c4, it looks like white can actually play queen takes e5, but this would be a disaster because black answers queen to b6. The white queen would then move away, and black just recaptures his piece on c3 with a really strong attack. So rook c4 was answered not by queen takes e5, but by queen to f2. Black now played knight takes d3, and this provoked the awkward reply rook takes d3, because if bishop takes d3, rook takes c3 by black would lead again to a crushing mating attack along this long dark diagonal. So white played rook takes d3, black played another easy move to understand, utilizing this c-file, rook fc8, once again threatening to capture on c3. White played queen e1, and now some interesting footwork by black, queen to d6. This has the threat of playing queen to b4. White answered this by playing rook h2. And here, if queen b4, white would play pawn to e5. So black blockaded that square with bishop to e5. Tremendous use of the blockading powers of the pieces. White's pawns at e4 and d5 are quite immobilized. Black plays bishop e5. White played rook from h2 to c2. And now black played pawn to b5, threatening, of course, pawn to b4, which would then win the white rook at c2. White defended rook from d3 to d2. This discovers an attack from the bishop and f1 on the rook at c4, so black had to retreat that, rook c5. Now white played queen to c1, still fighting hard, still trying for some tactical defenses. He plans to answer white's b4 by playing knight to b5. In fact, white is even threatening knight takes b5. And then black isn't able to capture by bishop takes b5, because then white would play bishop takes b5, and then if black plays rook takes b5, he loses his rook on c8. So, in reply to white's queen c1, black just played a quiet move, pawn to a6. No doubt he saw that Miles was running into time trouble, and he just consolidated his position and kept the pressure up. So pawn to a6, white looked round for a move and found knight to d1. And now black played his next trump, which was pawn to f3. As we mentioned, this was one of the advantages in black's position, which he might utilize, the threat of the passed pawn. Pawn to f3. White began to collapse pretty rapidly now. He played knight e3. Black played bishop f4. Once again using the dark square diagonals, a whole lot of white pieces all lined up, ready to be captured by the black bishop. Bishop f4, white queen e1, and once again black crept in. Black queen to e5. White rook takes c5, black rook takes c5. The threat here is black queen takes e4 check. White could have tried bishop d3, but then once again the queen just slips in, one move at a time, queen to d4, in through the black squares, and white would be completely helpless. So white didn't play bishop d3, but the move he chose was virtual suicide as well. He played rook d3, black played queen takes e4, white knight c2, an elegant self-mate, queen takes e1 check, knight takes e1, black rook c1, which is checkmate. Well, a beautiful display on the dark squares by Thipsay, and I think an encouragement for any player of the black pieces in the King's Indian. Now please return to diagram 7, and we'll look at white's other strategy, which is to castle kingside. So from diagram 7, white plays bishop d3, and black plays knight h5. White plays knight ge2. So black has started play on the king's side. Now he plays on the other side, knight c5, playing on both wings, in fact. Bishop c2, and black plays pawn to a5. It's very important to maintain this knight at c5. Black doesn't mind it being exchanged by white playing bishop takes c5, but he does object to white booting it out with b4. So pawn to a5 is important. We still don't know quite yet where the white king is going. That's why we haven't played pawn to f5 yet. If instead of a5 we played pawn to f5, white would take the chance to play e takes f5, g takes f5, and then probably g4. And this g4 is going to be much stronger because the white bishop from c2 is now pointing along the diagonal to h7. Maybe white doesn't play g4 straight away, he castles queenside first. But you can see the difference. In the Miles Thipsay game, the white bishop was much more passively placed at f1. So black waits a bit with his f5 move, and he plays this semi-waiting move, pawn to a5. White now plays castles kingside. If he'd played castle queenside, black would play bishop d7 and then b5, and a really strong attack coming. So white castles kingside. Now black chooses the moment f5. E takes f5, g takes f5. You might have wanted to take with the bishop or the rook, but white would then capture, and if you continue to capture with pieces, white will play g4 and fork two of your pieces. So you must take back with the g pawn. White now plays a3, black queen e7, white rook a b1, black king h8, white b4. We're following here the game Tarjan against Thipsay, and once again Thipsay won this game as well. So b4, a takes b4, a takes b4. The black knight has to retreat, goes back to d7, but this is still a pretty good central outpost, and the knight may later come round to e5 or f6, even b6 into c4 could be possible in some circumstances. So knight d7, white plays knight c1. And now here black took the opportunity to get his pawn thrust in. He played pawn to e4. White played e takes f4. And black played pawn to f4. And once again, white wasn't able to capture on f4 because his knight on c3 is hanging. So black, at the cost of a pawn, gained his positional advantages, the opening of the diagonal, the e5 square, and in this circumstance he doesn't have a passed f-pawn, but this f-pawn can be used later to go to f3 to break up the white king side. So black in fact gets a king side attack here. Now it's time to move on from the sameish variation to look at the four pawns attack. And this is one of white's most direct and aggressive attempts to overthrow the system of a King's Indian defense. Begins d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f4, black castles, kingside. White could now play e5, to which black would answer f takes e5. And now if white played d takes e5, black would exchange the queens, queen takes queen, white knight takes queen, and then play knight to e4 with a comfortable game. Or if instead of playing d takes e5, white played f takes e5, black's move would then be knight from f6 to d7, white plays knight to f3, and black plays pawn to c5, shattering the white center. Basically, white hasn't got the development, he hasn't got the king's safety to allow this sudden advance pawn to e5. So let's return to diagram 8. And instead of playing e5, white plays knight f3. Now here, for once, we don't play pawn to e5, we play pawn to c5. And leading to totally different types of positions to the ones we've been looking at. Now, in the first place, it looks like white can play d takes c5. To that, black will answer aggressively with queen to a5. He doesn't recapture on c5. Got a few tactics in mind, using his tremendous development lead. If white now unwisely plays c takes d6, black will capture knight takes e4. This pins the white knight at c3 and threatens a lot of dangerous things. If white plays now d takes e7, just black plays rook e8, and white's pawns are no way compensating for his virtually lost position due to his king exposure. So let's return to diagram 8. Play the move white knight f3, black pawn c5. White d takes c5, black queen to a5. Now black can play a bit more, white can play a bit more moderately with bishop to d3, guarding the e4 square. Black now captures queen takes c5, regains the pawn and stops white from castling kingside. So white plays queen e2 to prepare bishop e3, and black's next set of moves are very important, worth looking at carefully. Black plays bishop g4, white bishop e3, black queen h5, white castles, and black knight c6. And this position is actually good for black. If white plays pawn to h3, black will play bishop takes f3, white rook takes f3, and now black knight from f6 to d7, and black gets very good control of the black squares. He's threatening to come in onto d4 and onto c5. So very harmonious position for black. Now back again to diagram 8. Here white plays knight f3, and black plays c5. White now plays d5, not d takes c5. Black continues to attack the center with e6. And white plays bishop to e2. He could have played bishop to d3, and we'll look at bishop to d3 instead of bishop e2. Let's see how black answers that. Black plays e takes d5. Now if white plays e takes d5, it's quite awkward to him because black plays rook e8 check, and doesn't seem to be any really good interpositions for white. If he plays bishop e2, it's rather admitting defeat, because he could have played that instead of playing bishop d3 in the first place. So let's say white plays c takes d5. Now black plays rook to e8. White naturally castles. And now an instructive blow with his pawn. Pawn to c4. White plays bishop takes c4 here. Black will play knight takes e4 with a good position, having eliminated half white's center. Well, 1/3 of it. Made a big hole in it anyway. So after c4, white plays bishop c2, and black continues to offer these pawns. Pawn to b5. And if white doesn't take the b pawn, then black's pawn avalanche is very strong on the queen side. He eventually gets probably a passed pawn on the queen side, which is quite dangerous for white. On the other hand, if white plays knight takes b5, black answers queen b6 check, white knight b5 to d4, and now black takes on e4, regains his pawn with much the better game. Right, let's put the pieces back. Well, we'll go back to diagram 8, add the moves knight f3, c5, d5, e6, and now we're going to play bishop to e2, not bishop to d3. So bishop to e2, black now plays e takes d5, and we got a parting of the ways here. The standard move is going to be c takes d5, but we'll just look first at white playing e5. Now black plays knight g4. Here if white tries to play pawn to h3, the idea of pawn to h3 is that white hopes black will drop his knight back to h6, after which white will be able to play c takes d5, and then black hasn't got enough firepower on the e5 square to regain his pawn. So h3 is a very critical move. Now after h3, black plays in sacrificial style. He plays pawn to d4, hitting the knight, and white plays knight to e4, and now black plays the stunning knight takes e5, white f takes e5, and black d6 takes e5. And black's got a tremendous pawn center for his piece. The pawns are threatening to come down with pawn f5 and pawn to e4. Full compensation for black here. By the way, white can't even play knight takes c5 here because of queen to a5 check, winning the knight. Right, back to diagram 8, adding knight f3, c5, d5, e6, bishop e2, e takes d5. And if white goes e5, knight g4. Now here we're not going to look at h3. We're going to play c takes d5 for white. Black, on the other hand, can play d takes e5 now, which he does. And of course white continues to capture on e5, black just emerges with an extra pawn. So white's natural move again is to play h3. Once again, black doesn't retreat his knight, because white would just get a superb central crush with f takes e5. Instead he plays pawn to e4. This is basically to return the pawn and also to sort of split white's pawns up, so that instead of having, say, two pawns abreast on e5 and d5, black has got rather less impressive pawns on f4 and d5, separated from each other. Black will naturally have more squares in the center of his pieces. So e4, white plays h takes g4, black e takes f3, and white takes back with g pawn, g takes f3. He doesn't want to take with the bishop because his bishop is shielding his king along the open e-file. So g takes f3. Black plays rook e8, and now white plays a pawn sacrifice, pawn to f5. Black is well advised to ignore this pawn sacrifice, according to world champion candidate Kasparov, who is one of the specialists in this defense. Kasparov instead recommends black plays b6, and he's threatening then to move his bishop out to a6 to start an immediate counterattack on the white king. And this position we must reckon as rather unclear, both sides having attacking chances. But anyway, you should be fairly confident in this position. You'll be able to play bishop a6, maybe knight d7 to e5, and your pieces rapidly will come into action. Now I want to return to diagram 10, and this is after black played e takes d5 and white didn't play e5, he just captured c takes d5. In this case, black now responds tactically with pawn to b5, and this is another interesting sacrifice. Black is essentially trying to trade his b pawn for white's e pawn, and if white doesn't accept, then the thematic black pawn advance on the queen's side becomes very effective, with the idea of eventually gaining a passed pawn. So b5, if white plays knight takes b5, black will play knight takes e4. If on the other hand white plays bishop takes b5, we get the same sequence, a bit more complicated. Knight takes e4, white plays knight takes e4, and black plays queen a5 check, forking the bishop and the king. And here, if white plays knight c3, black just plays bishop takes c3 check. And after pawn takes c3, black plays queen takes b5. And basically white isn't able to castle, and black has much the better game, much the better development. Now instead of knight to c3, white can play king to f2. That's after the queen a5 check. Black plays queen takes b5, and white can win a pawn here by knight takes d6. Black's answer is queen to b6. White knight takes c8, black rook takes c8. Now if we look at this position, white is a pawn up, but his position is rather in disarray. He might not be able to castle, even artificially, and in particular his b2 pawn. It's not going to last much longer. Black should be able to play knight d7 and rook a8 to b8. So once again, good position for black. Please return again to diagram 10. Now here, after black's b5, white can play much more dangerously. He can play e5, as Keres chose against Spassky in the 1964 candidate encounter. Black plays d takes e5, white f takes e5, and now knight g4. With this move, black threatens the white pawn at e5. White defends it with bishop f4. Now a good line for black is to play pawn to b4. If white goes knight b5, pawn to a6, knight d6, and now black knight to d7, once again putting pressure on the e5 point. This is one line you might like to try. Now let's put black's knight back on b8, black's pawn back on a7, the other one back on b5, and white's knight back on c3. The continuation chosen by Spassky was also quite strong. He played knight from b8 to d7. White played e6, f takes e6, d takes e6, rook takes f4. Now white could go into the worse endgame by just playing e takes d7 and exchanging the queens, but this isn't very promising, is it? Because black has two bishops and a definite lead in development. So instead, Keres played a very sharp move, queen to d5, threatening the rook on a8, and also to play e7 check, which would win the black queen. Black had no choice but to play king h8, after which white played queen takes a8, winning therefore the exchange. But at a certain cost of tremendous activity for the black pieces. White king and rooks still on their original squares. Black's king and rooks, well, one of them's gone, but the other one is well in the fray. Knight to b6 was played by black, attacking the queen. White took a pawn, queen takes a7, bishop takes e6, recapturing and developing. White gratefully got his king into safety, castled, kingside. Black played knight e3, white rook f2, black pawn to b4, white knight to b5. And gradually black's pieces are taking up active positions, whereas white is just getting his pieces driven to all the edges of the board. And black's advantage was decisive. He won a great game, and in fact that candidate's match. The last variation I want to look at is the g3 line. If we go to the start position and play d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and now on the fourth move, just pawn to g3. Black castles, white bishop g2, and of course black's moves are all the same, whatever white does. Black pawn to d6, white knight to f3. Now Ravikumar's recommendation is knight to c6. Now, if white castles here, black should play bishop to f5. This is probably the most active continuation that black can choose. Bishop to f5, trying to control the e4 square. White plays rook to e1, and he's threatening e4, so black has no choice. He plays knight to e4. Now if white captures the knight, black will recapture with the bishop, and his bishop on e4 effectively neutralizes white's bishop on g2. So instead, white will move his knight from c3 to d5. Clearly plans to bring it round to e3 to attack white's bishop the black bishop at f5. Now, the normal move here was queen d7, but Ravikumar suggests queen c8 is a stronger continuation, and we'll soon learn why. After knight e3, black plays bishop h3, queen c2, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and black plays f5. Once again, very active game for black, very aggressive position. Let's put some of those pieces back. Have black's bishop on h3, white king on g1, white bishop on g2, white queen on d1, black pawn back on f7. Now, here white could play bishop to h1, threatening to discover with his knight somewhere and attack white's knight on black's knight on e4. Here black will play e5. And the point is that if white now plays d takes e5, d takes e5, white can no longer exchange the queens, which would be very useful to him to resist black's pressure, because the black queen is on c8, not d7. And if white plays something like knight takes e5, black chooses a strong desperado counter-sacrifice by knight e4 takes f2, and this is quite good enough to equalize. Now let's return to diagram 11 this time. Diagram 11 is the position after black plays knight to c6, and we've seen that if white just continues with castles kingside, black's bishop f5 followed by knight e4 looks very promising for black, very active game. Now instead white can go into the main line. Actually, you can transpose into the main line by going d5, and black really can't avoid this main line, so we're going to have to find something for black in the main line. White goes d5, black knight to a5. This knight threatens the pawn at c4. White defends it with knight to d2. There are not yet threats of white playing pawn to b4, trapping the black knight at a5, because black could then move his knight from f6 away and capture on c3. However, if white plays queen to c2, then definitely there are going to be threats of b4. That's why black plays here pawn to c5, which prevents white's pawn to b4. So pawn c5, white castles, and black now, to make some use of his knight at a5, starts to threaten the c4 square. He plays rook to b8, planning an eventual b5. White queen c2, black pawn to a6, white b3. This move shores up the c4 square and prepares a fianchetto to neutralize the black bishop at g7. Black plays b5, white bishop to b2. Pawn takes on c4, pawn takes on c4. Now, we have a very tactical series of moves coming up. Black plays bishop h6. Point of this move is to threaten bishop takes d2, followed by knight takes c4. So white can't stand for that. He plays f4. Black answers again, e5, once again aggressively, so hoping for f takes e5, after which he will be able to capture on d2 eventually. Now there was a game between Portish and Timman where Portish played d takes e6 here, en passant, and Timman recaptured bishop takes e6, but black's play was quite adequate. He has counterplay against the c4 square. So d takes e6 doesn't seem to work, and instead of that, white plays pawn to e3, thoroughly defending his f4 square. Black plays e takes f4, and white has to take with the g pawn. If he takes with the e pawn, he's just got too many weak squares on the e file to look after. So he plays g takes f4. Next comes black bishop to f5. Black's trying to provoke e4, which would increase the scope of his bishop on h6. Still, white doesn't oblige. He plays knight from d2, no, knight from c3 to e4. That still guards his pawn at c4. And there's a lot of pressure on the black knight at f6. Now comes the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes b2, queen takes b2, black knight takes on e4. Now if white plays knight d2 takes e4, bishop g7 looks okay for black, so white plays bishop takes e4. And here black continues in aggressive style with knight a5 takes c4. White captures, knight takes knight. Now black plays bishop f5 takes e4, with a very interesting position has arisen. It's been suggested by, once again, Garry Kasparov. Here black's got two bishops against rook and knight, two bishops plus a pawn against rook and knight. And balances like that, two bishops against rook and knight, are often reckoned to be equal, even though theoretically the rook and knight should be stronger. We must add to that the fact that the bishops seem to have good diagonals, and the white king looks seriously exposed. So this position could well be in black's favour. Right, well, thank you for listening to the tape on the King's Indian. I hope it'll bring you success and exciting, interesting games.